Okay, so we briefly talked about wrist osteology and motion. So then we are going to talk about wrist muscles and function. So a lot of the hand extrinsic muscles, which means they originate outside the hand and they cross the wrist, they have the function of wrist flexion extension as well because they cross the wrist joint. So they're multi-joint muscles. So we'll talk about the wrist muscles and then we'll talk about the hand extrinsics and very briefly a little bit about the hand intrinsics. But the hand extrinsics frequently share function with the wrist muscles. So of course you want to know the prime movers and all their attributes, identifying positions of active and passive insufficiency. So there is a special active and passive insufficiency in the hand and wrist called tenodesis, and we will talk about that and its function. Probably not in this lecture, we'll talk about it in the hand lecture, but store that away for later. How do wrist extensors aid in increasing grip strength of the finger flexors? We will talk about that. So the wrist extensors are the first group we're going to talk about. So they do wrist extension, not surprising. Most of the wrist flexors and extensors either have an ulnar bias or a radial bias. So they do ulnar deviation or radial deviation along with wrist extension or flexion. So there's a little diagram in the book which I'll share with you, which I think is a very nice representation. So you can tell whether they're going to do radial or ulnar deviation by where they attach, either medially or laterally. And the extensor carpi radialis brevis is just medial to the extensor carpi radialis longus. A lot of these muscles have really long names, so they have abbreviations, so you don't have to write them all out. So the extensor carpi radialis brevis is the ECRB and the longus is the ECRL. But their long names also tell you what they do. Extensor, it extends. Carpi, the wrist. Radialis, it does radial deviation. So in its name, it tells you its actions. Isn't that nice of it to do that? So it originates on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, which is known as the common extensor tendon. This should clue you into the fact that all the rest of the wrist extensors also originate here. Isn't that nice? Makes it easy. It inserts on the base of the third metacarpal, and just like its name says, it does wrist extension or radial deviation. All of the wrist extensors are innervated by the radial nerve. That makes it easy too. So just like I like the ankle muscles because they're organized into easy to remember functional groups, the wrist extensors are also organized into easy to remember functional groups, which have their function in their name. So that makes it super easy. The ECRL extensor, it extends. Carpi, the wrist. Radialis, it does radial deviation, and it's longer than the extensor carpi radialis brevis. So its name gives you a lot of info. It also originates on the lateral epicondyle at the common extensor tendon, and it inserts on the base of the second metacarpal. So the brevis is just medial to the longus. The longus is just lateral to the brevis. So that's their orientation of their insertions as well. So wrist extension, radial deviation, and it gets the radial nerve. The extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor, it extends the wrist. Carpi is wrist. Ulnaris, it does ulnar deviation. There's not a longus and brevis, there's only one of them. So its tendon runs in the groove between the head and the styloid process of the ulna. You don't have to know that. That's just a little fun facts about the extensor carpi ulnaris. It originates on the same place as all the other extensors. It inserts on the base of the fifth metacarpal. Fifth metacarpal is on the ulnar side. It does wrist extension and ulnar deviation, and it gets the radial nerve. These are easy, right? I said they're easy, and I wasn't kidding. So the wrist flexors also have a common insertion. Isn't that handy? The primary wrist flexors include the flexor carpi radialis, so it flexes the wrist and does radial deviation. The flexor carpi ulnaris flexes the wrist and does ulnar deviation. And the palmaris longus, that's the only one whose name doesn't tell you, but it goes to the palm, so that should tell you something. And not everybody has a palmaris longus. We were actually comparing palmaris longi in the office the other day. Yeah, we have so much fun in our office. And one person had one in one wrist and not in the other. One person didn't have either, and I have both. So interesting, right? So there is a secondary set of wrist flexors, which are the extrinsic hand muscles, and we will talk about them soon. So lots of wrist flexors, they have common origins, easy to remember names, yay. So if they're flexors, they're on the anterior surface of the arm and they get the median nerve. So the flexor carpi ulnaris is anterior, mostly superficial, starts medial and travels lateral to the insertion. It's common flexor tendon on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, goes to the base of the second metacarpal. It starts to sound repetitive because a lot of them are the same. Its name tells you what it does: wrist flexion and radial deviation, and it gets the median nerve, as they all do. The ones that attach on that do radial deviation get the median nerve, and the ones that do ulnar deviation get the ulnar nerve. So the flexor carpi ulnaris flexes the wrist and does ulnar deviation, gets the ulnar nerve because it's the ulnaris. It's superficial, it's slightly anterior on the forearm, and it's the only wrist muscle with a carpal insertion. Instead of inserting on the metacarpal, it inserts on carpals, goes from the common flexor tendon at the medial epicondyle to the pisiform and the base of the fifth metacarpal. So the pisiform is really embedded in the tendon, and it's that little bone that you can feel at the corner, the ulnar corner of your palm, if you want to think of it that way. That's your pisiform. Wrist flexion and ulnar deviation, it gets the ulnar nerve. The palmaris longus, it's anterior, it's an anterior muscle. It's absent in 21% of people. The tendon is at the midline. It gets the median nerve, and it's pretty prominent in people that have it. You can really see it. So when you're in lab, flex your wrists and see who's got a palmaris longus and who hasn't. So I don't know if we have a large enough sample size to get up to that 21% number. The inserts on the transverse carpal ligament and the palmar aponeurosis. The tendon is superficial to the flexor retinaculum, so it really pops out when you flex your wrist. If you have it, it pops right out. It assists in wrist flexion, but it mostly sort of puts tension on the transverse carpal ligament, and it gets the median nerve if you have it. If you don't have it, then it doesn't do any of that stuff, right? So the flexor retinaculum is like a wristband that keeps your flexor tendons from bowstringing when you flex your wrist, so they don't pop out. So since the palmaris longus is superficial to the flexor retinaculum, it pops right out when you flex your wrist, if you have one. So you can see right away if you have it. So the radial nerve courses down the posterior aspect of the forearm, and it supplies all of the wrist extensors. The median and ulnar nerve travel down the anterior aspect of the forearm and innervate all the wrist flexors. So the ones that have radialis in their name get the median nerve, and the ones that have ulnaris in their name get the ulnar nerve. Pretty easy, I hope. So this is the picture that I was talking about, where the wrist muscles can be classified into the primary set that attaches to the wrist and the secondary set that bypasses the wrist and attaches to the digits. So we haven't talked about the secondary set yet. We're going to talk about that in the hand. But all the muscles of the wrist cross axes of rotation located at the capitate bone. That's why the capitate is the captain of the hand. So that's the center of the hand. And so they all cross axes going through it, and they produce the movement at the wrist. So when you look at the different anterior versus posterior and flexor versus extensor and radial versus ulnar deviation, each muscle has its quadrant that it goes in, and it determines its actions. So the extensor carpi radialis brevis and extensor carpi radialis longus do extension and radial deviation, and some of the hand ones we'll talk about. The flexor carpi radialis and then some of the hand muscles do flexion and radial deviation. The flexor carpi ulnaris and some of the hand extrinsics do flexion and ulnar deviation. And the extensor carpi ulnaris does extension and ulnar deviation. So hopefully that makes sense. It's very, very organized. So it makes sense to me. If somebody had asked me to organize the wrist muscles, this is how I would have done it, because it makes sense. So flexion and extension occur about the medial lateral axis of rotation. Radial and ulnar deviation, anterior posterior axis of rotation, totally makes sense. The specific action of each wrist muscle is determined by its location of its tendon relative to the axis of rotation. It's just, it makes all sorts of sense. So during a grasp, when you're holding on to something, the wrist extensors position and stabilize the wrist for activities involving the fingers. So if you need to make a strong fist or grasp onto something or hold on to a branch to swing through the trees, if you want to think of it that way, the contraction of the wrist extensors is necessary to prevent the wrist from collapsing into flexion because of the strong flexion pull of the extrinsic finger flexor muscles. The wrist extensor muscles have to neutralize that a little bit, so they have to contract every time a grasp is made, so you can maintain that firm grasp. Okay. So if you take a force measuring tool that is pictured here, and you grip it with your wrist in full flexion, you're going to be weaker than if you grip with your wrist in slight extension. So a person with paralyzed wrist extensor muscles usually has difficulty making a grip even when their finger flexor strength is normal. So wrist extensors restore the contractility of those finger flexors when you combine the motions. So unless you return the wrist to the strength to the wrist extensor muscles for the person with paralyzed wrist extensors, you need to use a wrist extension splint to brace the wrist in extension so someone can grip onto things. So it's really interesting. Try it in the lab and see what you think about that. But having your wrist in a slightly extended position gives you a much stronger grip. So in order to neutralize the ulnar and radial deviation aspects of wrist motion, the flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris have to act at the same time as you're doing wrist flexion to take out the ulnar and radial deviation and get pure wrist flexion. So strong activation of all three flexors is usually required in conjunction with making a power grip, like holding onto a hammer or a pull-up bar, or that's a power grip. The palmaris longus also helps stabilize the proximal attachment of many of the intrinsic hand muscles. That having been said, 21% of people don't have a palmaris longus and they can still do it. So even though it has a function, you don't necessarily need it to survive. So the primary set of radial deviators is the extensor carpi radialis longus and the extensor carpi radialis brevis. So the radial deviators. that some of the finger and hand muscles, hand extrinsics, also do it. That's the secondary set, and we'll talk about them soon. So when we're doing a radial deviation motion, like lifting up a hammer to pound it down, our primary radial deviators are the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis. So muscles in both the hand extrinsics and the wrist activate, radially deviate the wrist. The extensor pollicis brevis, which is a thumb muscle, has the greatest moment arm of all the radial deviators, but it has a really small torque production. So the abductor pollicis longus, which is also thumb muscle, and extensor pollicis brevis provide stability to the radial side of the wrist along with the radial collateral ligament. So we have a lot of motion in our wrist, but it requires a lot of passive stability from ligaments and active stability from muscles, muscle synergists and neutralizers stabilizing those motions. So it's pretty interesting. So radial and ulnar deviator muscles are frequently used for activities that involve grasping and controlling objects held within the hand. This is a primary human activity, right? Because of strong functional association between flexor and extensor carpi ulnaris muscles, injury to either muscle can disrupt the overall muscular action of ulnar deviation. So if someone has rheumatoid arthritis, which causes inflammation and pain in that extensor carpi ulnaris tendon, it can really affect their grasping capability. So the wrist joint is composed of the radiocarpal joint and the midcarpal joint. There are only 2 degrees of freedom allowed at the wrist: flexion, extension, ulnar deviation, and it requires motion at both of those joints. But the wrist muscles are most responsible for positioning the hand so the hand can get in there and do things. So in the next section, we're going to talk about the hand. We're not going to go into super detail about everything about the hand because that is a specialty area, but we're going to hit the high points.